Sarah is a University of Missouri Extension Field Specialist in Natural Resources. She received her bachelor's degree in Forest Resource Management from MU and her master's degree in biology from Missouri S&T. In her position with MU Extension, she teaches adults and youth about forest and wildlife stewardship. Prior to joining MU Extension, she taught ecology and other biology courses at each Central College in Union, and she ran her own consulting forestry business. She enjoys working with private landowners to help them meet their objective for forest and wildlife. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for joining us this evening. Can you please tell us how money can grow on trees?
Absolutely. I'm so excited to be here tonight. And I will kind of go get right started with this. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about an introduction to timber sales and the 8 steps that we recommend that you as a private landowner go through in this process to do this in a way that is beneficial to you as the landowner and keeps our stewardship goals in mind so that this can be a long-term endeavor. It doesn't have to be a one and done on our property. We can do this multiple times in our lifetime if we do this correctly. So again, timber sales, so trees can be quite valuable. We sometimes don't think of them that way. Unfortunately, a long time ago in the real estate industry, we started writing off forested land as not having much value to it. And this has kind of continued to plague us as we go forward. But from my perspective in forest products, they can be quite valuable. The tree that you're looking at in this picture was a $5,000 walnut tree that was sold. Timber sales can also be part of our forest management. So again, when we think of timber sales, these can be a really frightening activity to do on our property because it does change the landscape and it does change things for quite some time. But we do incorporate timber sales into our forest management plans, and they can be done in a way that improves our forest health. So there's 8 basic steps of a timber sale that can make this a not always enjoyable, but can make it a process that is easy on you, the landowner, and also makes you feel good about it when you get to the end of the process. So I'm going to run through these today. And if you have any questions, I'll answer those all at the end. And I'll try to answer questions that have come up when I've done this program before, especially from if you're a woman landowner. This can be even more intimidating if you're trying to do this on your own. But I will tell you, I have worked with a lot of women landowners that have made their way through this and survived to see the other side and wrote it off as a good experience that they would do again. So the first process, before we even get started with loggers or foresters or any of that, is to know our boundary lines. So this is one of the first things that actually a logger will ask you before buying your trees. If he's a logger that is a good logger and worried about his reputation, he's going to make sure that you know your boundary lines. And this is so important because 50% of conflicts that come out of timber sales are going to come from boundary line disputes, being upset with the neighbor, a logger that gets over a line that's uncertain. So that can be one of the pitfalls. And it's one that we can take care of like right off the get-go. The next step is to select trees that are to be harvested. This can be, we recommend doing this with a forester. And I will say that this can be an emotional process for some of us. So if you've owned the land all your life, you lived on it all your life, maybe you planted trees with dad and those are now able to be harvested. This can be part of an emotional process. So having a forester that selects the correct trees to harvest, but then also reviewing yourself, which ones are marked, can help us kind of avoid some of those things that leave us not feeling so good about a timber sale when it's done. Determining timber volumes. So knowing how much and what you have to sell can be very important in this process. Identifying those potential wood products in the selected trees. I'm going to give you a little bit more details about these steps. So again, first, settling boundary disputes before you sell any timber, making sure you've marked your property lines correctly so that a logger can identify them and follow them if they're going to be logging trees in that area. And also, again, having a good relationship with your neighbor and talking about you know, that you're going to sell your timber, you have your boundary marked. A survey is a great idea to make sure that, again, you're within those boundaries. Most foresters, so when I mark timber as a consulting forester, I would, we kind of actually left kind of a buffer zone between neighbors and the boundary. And this, again, was one preventive measure we could put in place to prevent any of those disputes over trees. Selecting trees to be harvested. So this is something that you as a landowner should be involved in, but this is something that you should call on a forester for. And we have several options in Missouri as far as working with foresters. So Missouri Department of Conservation has a great staff of private land foresters that are able to help landowners with marking timber. I will put in a side note that you do have to have a management plan to work with them on a tree harvest on your property. You have another option of working with a consulting forester. So Missouri has a large group of consulting foresters. They're private. They would do, of course, charge a fee, but they will help you with selecting the trees to be harvested. So this can be a sustainable practice and also is done in the for sustainability of forest health. And you can find those folks. Usually your MDC foresters can also give you a good recommendation of a consulting forester. I used to be, unfortunately, I used to be the only female consulting forester in the state. And now that I work with Extension, I do not consult anymore, but there's still some really good ones out there. So again, they're going to select the trees to be harvested. They'll mark these with paint, and I'll show you a picture of what that looks like here in a little bit. But I do recommend landowners, even after you've had a forester come in and mark the ones that you know, are the right ones to be sold, they're the right age, they're the right condition, they take them out from the right place. It meets your objectives as far as, you know, opening the forest floor for some regeneration of your next stand of forest, perhaps meeting objectives of providing more forage for wildlife. So they're going to select the best trees to be harvested. And by best, I don't always mean this is the biggest and most beautiful trees that you have on your property. But these are the ones that by removing them, it leaves behind a great stand of trees, perhaps for the next harvest to happen. So again, they're going to measure them. This is a tool called a Biltmore stick, and this is used to measure the diameter of trees. And this provides us a lot of information as far as the diameter. We can use this information, it gets put in the computer. Then we measure how many logs. So a typical log in a tree is going to be 16 feet. And if we take that number of logs plus the diameter, we can kick out how many board feet are in a tree. And this is our typical measurement when we're selling timber. We will sell it by the board foot. And for most of us, this board foot is kind of an unknown to us, but it is really 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch if we were to think of a board. So if you were at Lowe's and you found a piece of wood that was 12 inches by 12 inches by 1 inch tall, that would be a board foot. So that's what we're measuring that's in that tree. This is what it looks like when we're all done marking the trees that are ready for sale. So a usually blue, orange, pink, anything but purple can be used to mark our timber sales. So purple is what we use to mark land boundaries in Missouri. So we do not use that to mark timber, but we'll use just about any other color. And then we will mark them generally these really long, tall kind of lines so that when a logger is walking through the forest, they can find those trees very easily for harvesting. We also put a spot. So in this center picture, you can see the spot on the, it's usually on the bottom side of the tree, or if it's on a hill, which most of our Ozarks are on hills. But that mark is there so that after that tree is cut, you as a landowner and your forester can go back and check the work of your loggers and make sure that they're taking just the trees that you have sold them and intend for them to cut. So that's an important part of the process. Also, if you look all the way to the right-hand side of the screen, there's an X on a tree. This is a delineation that we use to mark what we call a cull tree. So a cull tree might be a tree that has a hollow spot to it. It may be diseased. It's usually living, and we usually measure it, but we do not tally it when we're calculating how many trees that we are selling. But we do mark them with an X, and this indicates to the logger that that tree, perhaps it's in the way of another one and they need to take it down, so they can cut that tree without any penalties. It also, as a landowner, after a timber harvest is over, we might go back, and if some of those cull trees have not been cut already, we can lay those on the ground, and this just, again, helps us kind of meet some of our other forest management goals. So this is a quick look at post-harvest. So what those trees will look like when you're all done with it. So, but I'm skipping steps there. The next step is determining what it is worth. So your forester has come in, they've marked all the trees that are for sale. They will tally them, and they will give you, the landowner, how many trees they marked, what species they were, and how many board feet of each species that you have for sale. Some other factors besides species size and quality that will influence the price of our standing timber, this is also called stumpage, is how much you have to sell. So oftentimes if we have a smaller sale, we cannot get as high a prices per board foot as if we had a larger sale. And this has a lot to do with the expense that the logger will have when they bring their equipment to your property, and what they're hauling back and forth to the mill. So the greater the sale volume, actually, the greater the prices that we can usually get for timber. Where you are. So distance to a mill can actually really influence the price of our standing timber. And it is really funny in Missouri, you can go one county over and the price of timber can drop dramatically, and it has to do with distance to the mill. And this is because for those loggers, it costs them money to run those large trucks. And the further they have to drive, the more they have to take off the price that they offer to pay for that standing timber. Other things that influence the price of your standing timber is site accessibility. So do they have to do a lot of road building to access the timber? Will they have to, go across the field? Will they have to put in a whistle to perhaps get across the drainage? So those things can affect how much they offer you for your standing timber. Logging difficulty, so terrain can also affect those prices that they offer. And then a big one. So anyone who's probably familiar with selling livestock is probably familiar with market conditions. And just like in livestock markets, the price of timber changes throughout the year. So different seasons, we see different prices. We were affected by tariffs the past few years. That's led to a restricted market. So it's hard to believe, but about 54% of Missouri's timber actually goes overseas. So when we had the problems with tariffs, this did change our market conditions just a little bit. Competition. So if you have a lot of loggers competing, this will drive up prices for timber. If you're in an area where we don't have as many loggers, there is less competition, and sometimes prices can be lower. Another factor that influences the price of standing timber is logging restrictions. So different property has different restrictions. So again, private landowners, they get to set their own restrictions for their loggers. And generally what I see with this is they'll set restrictions like, we hunt firearms deer season, so we really would prefer you not to be in there logging during that time. On public land, they run into issues. So about 5 years ago, we started putting in restrictions on when we can log on public lands because of bat habitat. So all federal and most state land can't be logged on April through October because of bats. So again, if you have timber to sell and they can log on your property during the summer, this can again influence the price and make it actually better for you as the landowner. Determine your selling method. So there's two common methods we use in Missouri and that we recommend. So one is a sealed bid sale and the other one is a negotiated sale. I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of both of these. So a sealed bid sale, just how it sounds, we will send out a notice. And this is one of the reasons that working with a a consulting forester or an MDC forester can actually be really beneficial, because this part of it, most foresters will take care of for you. So they will put together your advertisement for your sale. They'll send it out to loggers, so your potential buyers. They will let those loggers have 2 to 4 weeks usually to inspect the timber. So they'll sometimes they'll have a showing. They probably have not been doing that very much, since we try not to have groups gather right now. But they will allow accessibility to that property so that a logger can walk through and put together their bid or their idea of what they want to pay for that timber. Each bidder will submit a single sealed bid, and all late bids are rejected. So we have to keep this. It's important, again, to build trust with your logger even before they become your logger. So we, single bid, no late bids allowed. They get opened at a specified location and a specified time. We do ask that they all mail their bids in. So I've not heard of any foresters using email bids or fax bids. So they usually specify that it has to be mailed, again, just to keep this completely honest. And again, this helps build trust with those loggers beforehand. We do always put in the bid that the seller has the right to reject any and all bids. So if your forester has come up with a projected price that, that's what you want to get for your timber, if you get in bids that are well below that or nothing that kind of meets your needs, you have the right to reject any and all bids. And then, of course, we always, again, this is building trust with your logger, but no price negotiation is allowed once a bid has been selected and the unsuccessful bidder is notified. So again, most of the time when we do a sealed bid process, the landowner accepts the highest bid. But if for whatever reason, maybe there's a logger you want to work with who was the second highest bid, you can select that bid, but you'll have to let those unsuccessful bidders know about that. The other way that we can sell timber is called a negotiated sale. So this, and this is often done a couple different ways. So sometimes the negotiated sale happens even without the forester. So logger comes up and offers you a certain price, face-to-face talk with a single buyer. So this is called a negotiated sale. In this case, the buyer has no competition, and usually our seller is uninformed. So they aren't going to know what it's worth when they sell it. And you may not have any other information from other loggers. So you don't know if you could have gotten more money for your timber, or maybe you got a really great deal and you sold it for a large amount of money. In a negotiated sale, it's a little bit, it's not as clear cut. However, a negotiated sale may be your best method. So say you have a small volume for sale, and when we talk timber sales, anything less than 20 acres is usually considered a pretty small sale. So they usually like to work larger tracts of land if possible. So if you have a small amount of timber for sale or a small tract that you're trying to sell, this negotiated sale may be a good way to go. If you have timber that's poor quality, so we have some woodlots in Missouri that have been cut over a couple times, or perhaps they've had wildfire go through. So we have a little bit of poor quality there. So we might be able to do one of these negotiated sales to kind of start that regeneration process, to start working on improving our forest health. The negotiated sale also works a lot if a landowner has a specific person that they want to work with. And again, this happens from time to time. Like, I know this logger, I've worked with him before, or we know this logger from, anywhere that know someone and you want to work with them specifically. So you don't want to go through that bid process and perhaps end up working with someone you don't know. Then after you've decided how you're going to sell, so if you're going to sell it on a bid process, or if you're going to do it as a negotiated sale, then you will determine your payment method. So lump sum is the way that I would put a star by, is what I recommend is your payment method. But there are instances of selling timber sales on what we call a yield sale or selling on scale or selling on shares. You might have heard the term selling on shares. And in a lump sum, this is where you get a single payment before harvest begins. So again, kind of ideal steps. You've marked your trees for sale. You know exactly how many board feet, what species, and how many of them you have for sale. You've put out a bid. They've sent back, you know, the amount of money they're going to pay you, and then they pay you in a lump sum. So this is where you get paid for your timber before the harvest begins. The payment is based on volume that's estimated, not on what's harvested. So if they've bid a certain amount on that volume that your forester has calculated, that's what you get paid for. In some cases, you know, they may, so some of the advantages that all the risk is on the buyer. So again, when we measure how many trees we're selling in the board feet, this is estimates based on the forester's experience and knowing how much timber is in a standing tree. I'd like to say it's a completely exact to the board foot science, but it is not. So their payment is based on what they've offered you, and that's based on that volume estimated. Sometimes it'll cut out to their advantage, so they'll cut out more board feet than we've estimated, and sometimes they'll cut out a little bit less. I will say that it's usually within about 100 board feet per acre, so it's not, I've not been involved with any timber sales where we've had a really large discrepancy between how many we measured and what they cut out. I'll also let you know that loggers are really good at walking through the forest and knowing what's there before they put in their bid. So they, again, are pretty good at knowing what they're buying. The advantages to this is that you're already paid before they start harvesting. The risk is on the buyer for it cutting out how they want it to cut out. And then a disadvantage is that you lose if the estimates are wrong. So say they cut out a lot more board feet than your forester estimated, and this would be a disadvantage to you. In a yield sale, or an AKA selling on scale or selling on shares, this is where the logger will come in. They'll spend the day cutting in the forest. They'll take a load of logs into town, take them to the mill. At the mill, they get scaled out. So they get measured, and then the mill pays them for each of those logs that they've brought in. The logger brings that scale ticket back to you, the landowner, and they will usually on a predetermined amount. So sometimes 60-40, sometimes 50-50. They'll pay you, the landowner, 60% or 50% of what's on that scale ticket, and then they'll keep the other 50 or 40%. This does require someone somewhere to determine the volume, which happens usually at the mill, and they do give mill tickets. The advantage to this, that you, the seller, would be paid for what is actually harvested. So you're being paid for what they actually took off your property. The disadvantages to this is that accurate tally is difficult once those logs have left your property. So if you are perhaps an absentee landowner, or perhaps someone that works a job during the day, so you're not on your property the entire time that they're logging, it's hard to say how much that they have taken off the property. And there's a little bit of trust in this type of payment method that they're going to bring you every single mill ticket that they have. So as a seller, you assume some risk. After you've determined that you want to do a bid, or you want to do a lump sum, then you need to advertise your sale. So again, this is part that a forester can help you with, and they often take care of for you. So this includes your name as the seller, your address, and your telephone number, a legal description of where the sale can be found, a description of the marked trees, the type of bid, so again, lump sum or selling on shares, visitation times to inspect the timber, a date, time, and place when bids will be opened. So we also like to specify all that information so it's very clear, so they know how long they have to get it in. Again, we usually leave somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks for bids to come in. If there's a down payment required, so 5 to 10% of the bid is pretty common that they'll pay you right. Pretty much as soon as they accept if you accept their bid, they'll pay you 5 to 10%, and then we'll have to pay you the rest before they start logging. You also want to put in your harvesting restrictions. So this can be anything that meets your needs. So in some cases, again, this will be times of year. So if you're a hunter, we don't want loggers in the woods during deer season, or perhaps spring turkey season. So those will be the restrictions that we put in. A performance bond, and this is often something that foresters are really good about putting in there, and then it's a good thing for them to check periodically. So this includes things like they won't, so sometimes, I shouldn't say sometimes, all the times there will be some residual damage to your remaining trees. So when we skid logs out, they'll rub against a tree here and there, and this will cause damage to them. So we will set what we call a performance bond that says, you can only have 3 damaged trees per acre or 2 damaged trees per acre. And then when your forester comes out to inspect the sale, they can measure those performance bonds. And what we say is if you've perhaps injured more trees than what we had in the performance bond, then you need to pay us X amount of dollars for each of those trees. Insurance. So we often, before letting people on our property, want to know that they have proper insurance in place. And then your seller's right to reject any and all bids. And just a couple examples of what those bid forms and invitations to bid look like. So this was a property is 46 acres. You can look at the breakdown of species and number of trees, and then the volume. And then all the information about who to contact, when to submit, the bid form that they sign off on, and where to submit that bid. So, and then we also really like to give them a good description of where they're going to find those trees that they are bidding on. And then this has just kind of by size class. So again, this gives them a really good indication. And this helps loggers and foresters give a good estimate of value. So we can pull different, there's different forest products that we pull from different size trees and different species of trees. So one of our most valuable trees in Missouri is white oak, and we use it for the stave industry. So it gets made into barrels, which makes it quite valuable, but it actually has to be, there's a minimum size and there's a maximum size that those white oaks have to fit in to be able to be sold as staves. So this helps those loggers determine that. It also helps your forester when they're determining how much it's worth. This is not a step, but when you are considering bids, we definitely say that you should insist on a trained logger. So Missouri has two trainings for loggers. So professional timber harvester training is a 5-day course that helps them with best management practices. It also requires them to do continuing education so that they stay up to date on their safety certifications, their best management practices. And we recommend insisting and trying to work with these professional timber harvesters. And then they can actually go one step further and become a Missouri master logger. And this is just kind of a seal of excellence that loggers can have. And if they are a part of the Missouri Master Logger Program, they will be periodically audited to make sure that they are meeting those requirements to remain in that program. So again, these are things that you can put on your bid packet if they're a master logger or if they're PTH. I will say that probably 75% of loggers in Missouri that are a business that's continuing to log and has logged for a long time will go through that professional timber harvester training. And I'll put in a plug, professional timber harvester training is actually open to landowners as well. So I actually just went through this program this past summer. So I won't be starting a logging crew anytime soon, but it was a great training to learn about chainsaw safety and how to fell trees and more about best management practices. So if, as a landowner, you're interested, it is open to landowners as well. The next step is to prepare a timber sale contract. So this is a good, you want to have a sample of this, and it should reflect your same elements as advertised, but a little more detail. This is going to protect the interest of a seller and buyer. So as soon as you accept your bid, then you would present that contract to your logger, and they would sign it. You can also have this notarized to add just one more layer of protection. And again, this is you really want this to reflect the same elements that you advertise in your timber sale announcement. And this it has a lot of detail. It usually has how a conflict's going to be resolved. So if they cut a tree that they weren't supposed to cut, how are we going to resolve that? Will they pay a fee? Will they, how can we make that work? If we need to bring in a third party, we'll put that into the contract that, conflicts will be resolved utilizing our forester as our representative. We also can put such things as, we also definitely put in contracts, they're going to clean up after themselves. So they're going to pick up all the trash that they might have had. No paint cans will be on site. So that protects you from the marking trees that you didn't intend to have marked. You may want to have this reviewed by a lawyer. So when I worked with landowners, it was about 50-50 of how many had a lawyer look over it and how many didn't. We do have through MU Extension Guide G5057 is the basics of basic elements of a timber sale, and it has a great sample contract. Pretty much anything you can think of. Some new things that I've been encouraging landowners to put on timber sale contracts have a lot to do with invasive species. So having a logger clean their equipment before they bring it to your property so they're not bringing in any seeds of invasive species. Those are good things to also put on that contract. Again, contracts should dictate adherence to best management practices. So this is going to help prevent things like erosion, water quality, deterioration from a timber sale. It also can include a provision for a performance bond that's supplied by the buyer. So again, that's those residual tree damage, if they leave ruts over a certain size. So those are things that are in that performance bond. You do want to keep in mind that seller-oriented contract stipulations usually increase the buyer's costs and may reduce your net selling price of your timber. So if you have a lot of restrictions that are in your contract, like you can only cut during this time period and it's extra restrictive, or another one that usually will take off a little bit of money is in our contract, we always put that they need to reseed where they've placed the logs. That's called the landing. So where they've loaded their trucks up, we always require that they reseed that. In some recent contracts I've seen have asked that the logger reseed with native seeds. So this can increase the price because those native seeds can cost quite a bit more per pound. So again, the more stuff that you have in there, this will increase that buyer's costs, and it could reduce how much they pay you for it, but it may make you happier in the long run. Supervise the harvest. So I definitely encourage all landowners to, start from the beginning to build a rapport with your logger. Before it even begins, walk that sale with your forester and your logger, talk about expectations, build that relationship. And that can go a long way when we have any conflicts that come up. While they're logging, again, a safety measure, you don't want to go right in the middle of a logging operation during active harvesting, but you can visit your harvest operation in the evenings. You can visit that, before or after they've started. I recommend visiting with your logger just a little bit in the morning and going over what they're cutting that day, what sort of, how long you can expect them to be there. I think this really helps them understand what you're looking for. It also makes you feel better about this whole process. And before your logger leaves your site completely, make sure that all the sale provisions have been satisfied. So everything that's in your contract. So this includes things like building water bars on any skid trails, reseeding the landing, removing all trash, just making sure all that is done before they leave. Again, makes you feel good about it at the end. And the last step is practice good forestry. So before and after a timber sale is just as, if not more important than those forestry practices we use during a timber sale. So we use timber harvest as a management tool, and we use it to improve habitat, and we like to see good forest stewardship before and after those timber sales. So the last part I have is some real advice from some other women landowners. So I have kind of a group of women landowners that have navigated either timber sale with a spouse or perhaps on their own. But these were kind of their top advice that they gave for me to pass along. So the first one is not to sell on a whim. So it happens all the time. The loggers working on your neighbor's property or property nearby, they knock on the door and they're like, we see that you have some forest back there. We're logging. We'll offer you X amount of dollars to log in there. And it sounds really good. Like it sounds like a lot of money. So this can be tempting. However, we wouldn't sell a cow without knowing what it was worth. We shouldn't sell our trees without knowing what they're worth. Because again, you could have that $5,000 tree sitting back there and you've given it away. This can go from being an easy process to a hard process if you don't have a plan in place. Other advice is to find help. So again, Missouri Department of Conservation or private consulting forester are a great place to find help for those timber sales. If you don't know your MDC forester to find, or you're looking for a private consulting forester, also feel free to reach out to Extension so we can also point you in the right direction of finding help to get started on this process. Again, know what your trees are worth. You wouldn't sell anything else without knowing or having an idea of what it's worth. So you should do the same for your trees. And then the other thing that I really encourage is asking questions. So sometimes this can be an intimidating process, especially if you're doing this alone as a woman. It can be an overwhelming process and it can be a little intimidating. I'm not gonna lie, but I highly recommend asking questions along the way to make you feel comfortable with what you're doing, because unfortunately with the timber sale, we do have to live with the results for a long time. It takes a little bit for that to regenerate. So asking questions and getting a firm hold of what you're doing goes a long way to feeling good about it. All right, and now I'm ready for the question part.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. We appreciate you sharing that information with us. It seems like there's a lot to learn there. And so I appreciate you giving us some advice. And Amy, we had any questions come in for Sarah?
We sure have, Sarah. We've got a lot of questions for you. The first one is, who are typically the end users of Missouri trees?
So it depends what type of trees we sell. So I can kind of go through species just a little bit. Most of our walnut will actually be sold overseas to be made into furniture. Our oaks that are like red oak, black oak, post oak, they will end up staying in the US. So most of those will go to, depending on quality, they'll go to railroad ties, they'll go to blocking, or if they're of lesser quality, they'll go to pallet mills. And then our white oak, the end users for most of our white oak is going to be the barrel, the cooperage industry. So they'll go to a stave mill where they get cut to the correct lengths, and then they'll end up going to the cooperage, which is actually where they make the barrels. So the end users for those will be, and I will say Missouri is, so we go back and forth with Kentucky. So as who produces the most white oak barrels. This year, I think we're winning. But our white oak barrels go everywhere from France to Chile to California to go to those wineries and distilleries.
Okay, another question that came in was, approximately how big or how old of tree should I consider selling? Or is this different between different species of trees and areas?
So it does vary sometimes from species to species. As a general rule, so we call the timber basket kind of south central Missouri. That's where most of our forest is. So when we get down there, we have a lot more competitive and a lot more competition, a lot more mills. And so we can actually cut trees from 10 inches DBH, and DBH is diameter at breast height. So we have kind of a universal measuring system where we measure all trees at 4.5 feet off the ground. So for me, this is actually chin length because I'm 4'11". And so this is where we measure them all. So we can actually cut down to 10 inches in some of those areas. When you get over to Southwest Missouri and Northern Missouri, we usually 12 inches diameter is usually our minimum.
Okay. Now, what about the time of year, the best time of year to sell your timber? You touched on it a little bit, but do you have any more details you can share on that? And what is the best time of year to sell your timber?
Yeah, so sometimes it varies even from year to year. If we can sell where they can harvest over the summer, we can get a little bit better prices because, again, they're not as busy and they don't have as many other opportunities to buy on public lands. So this can be a good time to sell. I will tell you that it is a little bit of a process. So it takes some time. So oftentimes a forester, if you have them in, they'll mark it, tally it, calculate that and get it back to you to look at. And then you have that 2 to 4 week period of bidding and then opening of bids. And most timber contracts that I've written, we give that logger a 1 year window to cut it. So then again, they should be done within a year. We do encourage landowners to have some leniencies when we have, like we had so much rain in 2018 that we really encourage landowners to be a little bit lenient with their loggers because we definitely would prefer to give them a little more time on those contracts versus leaving really large ruts on our property. So there's not always a great time of year, and I should have included a resource, and I'll try and type it in the comments during the break or during the next presenter. There is a quarterly report that the Missouri Department of Conservation will put together, and this has the current prices. So they collect data, and again, this is a voluntary thing, so you have to take it with a grain of salt, but the foresters and the loggers will put in what they've paid or what they've sold species and the measurement that they sold it on and how much per board foot they sold it for. So, and this is published quarterly by MDC. So you can kind of follow that. It's not always a great predictor of what the next quarter will do, but it does give us an insight as to current prices. So if we're thinking about selling timber, it gives you a really good idea of what the going rate is right now. So walnuts are most valuable. And it does sometimes have a little bit different sales process. So I kind of went through if you're selling, 20, 40, 50 acres, 100 acres of timber, this is kind of the process. Walnut, if you can sell as few as 5 or 10 trees at a time. So we do have those marked by a logger or marked by a forester and measured. And if they are really, really valuable black walnut, what they'll actually do is sometimes they'll have a logger come in, harvest them, they'll lay them out, and they will have buyers come in. It kind of looks like one of those tuna auctions, but they'll come in and bid on individual logs for black walnut.
Okay, thank you. Is there any value in managing your timber to almost be like a value added process, if you will? Like, are there things that people can be doing to get more value out of their trees later on?
Yes, so absolutely. So some things that we do, kind of what we call pre-commercial management practices, so we can actually thin our timber. So if you have a stand that you have smaller trees, maybe 4, 6, 8-inch trees, you can pick what we call your crop trees. So these are going to be a species that's of value. They have straight trunks with the limbs or branching starts at a really high point. So you have a lot of clear timber. Those can be your crop trees. And something you can do is open up the canopy for those crop trees so they can get more sunlight and they don't have to share as many resources with as many trees around them. So we call this, it comes under quite a few different names. So sometimes a pre-commercial thinning, sometimes you'll hear it called a timber stand improvement or a forest stand improvement. It's pretty much all the same forest practice, but this can increase your value for timber sales down the road. Some other small things you can do to increase value is trimming things like grapevines or invasive species vines like honeysuckle, multiflora rose. Those will grow up in trees and they will hinder growth. and kind of suffocate your trees. So if you're trying to get more growth on your trees by removing those invasives and things that compete with the canopy, this can improve the value over time. And also for our high value trees, so white oak and black walnut, you can do some pruning. And so nature usually does this for us in the forest, but perhaps you have some black walnut growing in a bottomland and they aren't as densely populated in that area, so they're not going to self-prune. You can go through and actually prune those lower branches to increase the amount of clean wood that you have on the stem.
So you talked about you know, the timber harvest and the sales and the value there, but what about post-harvest? Do you see in working with landowners that there are some benefits post-harvest that they'll actually see? And are there any specific management practices that they need to be putting into place after that timber is harvested?
Yes, oh, that's a great question. So post-harvest, I joke that sometimes this is when the work begins. So your forest will have some time to regenerate, but this is a good time to also make sure if you have any invasive species that you are trying to eradicate this from your understory. So things like honeysuckle, autumn olive, multiflora, they'll shade out regeneration. So our goal a lot of times with timber sales is to open the canopy up enough that sunlight is hitting the forest floor. So we have new trees starting. So that's kind of our next generation of forest. And those invasive species can shade that out. Oftentimes, anywhere from 10 to 15 years after a timber sale, especially a selective harvest timber sale, we will recommend going through and doing a pre-commercial thinning. So kind of selecting your next crop trees that you're going to encourage. And this, again, speeds up the process. So it all would happen naturally. So forests thin themselves naturally over time. But when we go through and do our foresting improvements, this kind of just speeds up the process for us a little bit. Also, just making sure that you are following those best management practices. Sometimes things like water bars that are on skid trails need repairs over time, so they last anywhere from 3 to 5 years. If you continue to use those skid trails as a road on your forest, it's good to go back and keep up with that. If you have a management plan, which as a forester, I highly recommend having a management plan. Those get updated we recommend updating them every 10 years. So trees are constantly growing, which means that those plans can be adjusted for that. Another thing is, so I won't paint a super, it's not going to be beautiful after a timber sale because a logger will leave the tops of the trees in the woods, and you will see stumps. But there's a couple different things where we talked a little bit about value-added products with the last question. There is a potential to use those tops for things like mushroom cultivation. So shiitakes in particular like to grow on oak trees. So there's kind of an opportunity for that value-added process there, whether you want to do it as a hobby or perhaps something that you turn into a small business side, that's up to you. Firewood, so there are some buyers of firewood out there, so people who sell to things like state parks or campgrounds, they will come in and harvest those tops for you to become firewood. So there's a few processes that can actually, again, help you speed up the natural decay of those tops and remove them. It will brush up. So again, just kind of giving you that things to keep in mind is that it will get a little brushy in the understory as we introduce more sunlight. For us as humans, again, we love walking through open, clean woodlands. It's really nice and pleasant for us to walk through. But from a wildlife perspective, so if you're trying to also encourage wildlife on your property, they like that brushy. So they can hide in that from predators. It's great for species like quail. Deer will hide their young in it. It provides them browse. So new regenerating trees and some of that, what we consider brush, is going to provide a food source for them.
Okay, another question is there ever an advantage to felling the trees but not selling them right away?
Not not usually. So as soon as we fell the trees, they will start the breakdown process. So this can decrease the value of them. And I will, from a tax perspective, so when we sell the standing trees on our taxes, this becomes a we can do and I'm not a tax person by any stretch of the imagination, but we can calculate the tax basis for that. And if we sell a tree that we have already felled and that's on the ground, then we're selling a product versus selling a standing tree. And it has different taxes and it'll cost you more actually in taxes to sell that cut tree.
Okay, so kind of on that fun topic, taxes. Now let's, what about liability? Does a landowner need to have specific liability insurance before allowing a logger on the property?
So that is all covered in the contract, that they have their own liability insurance for themselves and any of their employees that are on your property, and that you will not be held liable for any, injuries or anything else that goes awry.
Thank you. We
Well,
appreciate you spending some time with us this evening and whetting our appetite for maybe some potential timber harvest on our properties.
Yeah, so
So
thank you for having me.
thank you.